Welcome to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. The podcast that covers all things about humans, technology, and particularly the bit in between.
And welcome to this episode of 1202, the Human Factors Podcast, with me, your host, Barry Kirby. Before we get into the main episode, as usual, I've got a couple of parish notices that I wanted to mention. Firstly, thank you to everybody who's given me feedback on the evolution of the way that this podcast is being delivered. I recognise that with everything that I do, not everything goes as smoothly and effectively as I would like, but everyone puts up with my varying levels of incompetence. You put up with it all with good humour. Having said that, I'd really encourage anyone to get in touch with any suggestions, comments, and questions. I'm really keen to learn from others about the sort of things that you do and the sort of skills that you think I should be including in this. Obviously, the latest thing around this is video editing and that type of thing, and that is definitely something that we're pushing forward with. Secondly, I've got a couple of questions. I've had a couple of questions on how you could show some support for the podcast, which is a really nice thing to hear. In the grand scheme of things, this is, for me, a rather self-indulgent hobby, and certainly not an income stream in any way. But if you did want to show that you're a podcast supporter, then you could have a look at our merch store, which is on our website at 1202podcast.com. That currently has a 1202 hoodie, wonderfully modeled by Leo, my son. But if you think there's other items that you would like to purchase, then again, I'd love to hear your suggestions. We're currently thinking of things like mugs, pens, and keyrings. But is there other things that you might think would be more appropriate? And if you would like to buy them sort of things, it'd be really useful for us to let me know, because then I can get on and make them. If nobody wants them, then I won't, and I'll just create my own little mug, and it'll sit there on my desk, and I'll be very proud of it. Anyway, on to today's episode. Towards the end of last year, we had an episode that looked behind the scenes of EHF 2022 with David Golightly and Nora Balfe. I'm really pleased to say that the experience didn't scare either of them off, and both have agreed to come back and tell us more about what they're doing in their day job. That is when they're not organising conferences. So I'm really delighted to welcome David Golightly back to the podcast. Welcome, David, and thank you very much for coming back and joining us again.
Hi, Barry.
So before we get into the main topic, where we're going to explore a bit more about the work you do within the rail industry, can we just find out a bit more about you? Because last time when you were on the podcast, we didn't really get under the cover of really who you were. We were very much focused on what we were going to deliver in EHF 2022. So could you give us a bit of an insight into what your current role is and kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So I'm a lecturer. I lecture in it's human systems integration is my title. And I guess there's maybe a good pub conversation to be had about what that title actually means. Can you actually integrate a human within the system? Surely they're already part of the system. But nonetheless, that's my job title I've got. So human systems integration, and that's within the School of Engineering here at Newcastle University. So I teach human factors elements primarily in the mechanical engineering course. So I'll give students an overview of basics of ergonomics, physical ergonomics, cognitive ergonomics, more organizational factors. And then I also do some kind of targeted lectures in some of the more specific courses. Say we do a course on transportation, intelligent transportation system, and I give them a human factors lecture. That's the teaching side. And then, like most academics, did a lot of research around that, of which I would say probably about these days, about 70% of it is rail related, and another 30% is in other aspects of mobility. But historically, I've worked in research in areas like manufacturing as well, or smartphone applications, HCI, those kind of topics.
I'd say your background, and I'd really recommend anybody goes and sort of has a browse at your LinkedIn profile or your basically your academic history here, because you're one of these people who've done pretty much everything in terms of the breadth of work that you've been involved in. I think I do find your entire background fascinating, and just that level of experience that you've managed to pull together. The students that you're engaging with must feel, I guess, kind of privileged to be able to be able to get some of that experience off you.
Well, I mean, it's great to be able to communicate some of that, because I did work in industry, the commercial sector, for a number of years. Yeah, I mean, I'm like a lot of human factors people who come up more from the psychology track. I came up did undergraduate in psychology, I then did a PhD, which was human-computer interaction. It was very, and certainly in the 90s, that was kind of a, dare I say, almost like a traditional psychology subject. But it was kind of frustrating. It was all about noodling about with screens and mouse pointers and things like that. And I was like, well, surely there's something more about what people are actually trying to achieve here, rather than just, how quickly they can move a mouse around. And yeah, so I worked in the commercial sector, telecoms, for 2 or 3 years when the 3G boom was just starting, and financial services doing HCI. And that, there's a lot of things about understanding what a project manager is, understanding what a business analyst is, how you can integrate usability, HCI, human factors within those kind of functions, how you work with people like marketing, software development, stuff like that. So that was all great insight. But I knew the people at University of Nottingham, the Human Factors Group, particularly Sarah Sharples. We're good friends, go back a long way, and there was an opportunity to do some work in there that was, again, more domain focused. I like doing some of the consumer stuff, but what always interested me was expertise and experts.
Right.
Back to my undergraduate stuff, how do experts see the world, how they interpret the world? And so there was an opportunity to do some work around that, looking at, in this case, experts in the rail sector. And dare I say it, I always like to train. So the opportunity to put those two things together was kind of an ideal job, really. So yeah, worked in human factors at the research group at Nottingham, HFRG, for I think it was 11 or 12 years, and then came up here to Newcastle about 4 years ago.
That's really cool. But rewind it right to the back. You said you did your undergraduate. Why human factors in the first place? Why this field at all? What was your driver? What was the inspiration?
Again, I think it was. I've always been interested in that expertise. Going back to my undergraduate, when I second, third year of undergraduate, did a cognitive psychology course, and the bit that really kind of lit a fire under me was that kind of way that experts see the world differently, the way they structure the world differently, the way they see sort of problems differently, the way that we would approach things at a surface level, they see a deep structure. Even now, when I watch Match of the Day, I'm less bothered about the football. I like the punditry in the middle, because it's all about how they kind of, they talk about the game in a way that, I didn't see that. So I think that's all fascinating. And then I did a couple of projects not long after my PhD, working with Rolls-Royce, the aerospace jet engines. Again, thinking about how they were using knowledge. At that stage, it was kind of knowledge management, knowledge engineering within their development processes. So that became a big part of it. And then it was fusing this HCI element to that kind of understanding knowledge and expertise. Putting those two together, it just seemed to be that human factors was a natural port of call for me. But I sort of had to bide my time a bit till I found the right opportunity, which luckily came through Nottingham University.
So when you did your undergraduate degree, was that psychology itself, or yeah? So why psychology in the first place? Why not something like, I don't know, but anything else? What was the driver behind psychology?
That's a really good question. I guess I'd go back. I'd always been interested in how I thought about things.
Okay.
Again, I really traditional thing, how people solve problems. I love that bit when you're playing a game or a puzzle, doing a puzzle, where you suddenly think, this game isn't about this, it's about something else. I'm not do that point where you probably didn't fritter hours of your life away playing Candy Crush, but for a while I did.
I might have.
And it's that point where you kind of like, oh no, I haven't got this. I see this problem in a different kind of way. It's not just about crushing candies. It's about grouping things in certain ways and structuring it. And again, I think that was always interesting. The way things like navigation and stuff like that always interested me. So I was always interested in kind of, how do we solve problems? How do we interpret the world? How do we make sense of ourselves in the world? And so I had the opportunity I was doing psychology and computing science as a joint up in Aberdeen.
Yeah.
And the computer science baffled me. It still kind of does, which I guess is kind of why I work a bit in HCI. But as people always say to me, I can't help fix a problem with a computer, but I can help you understand why you can't fix it.
Yes.
So the psychology is what really kind of, again, really interested me. We did a lot of stuff on artificial intelligence then and about rules and expert systems. So again, that's kind of really what got me started on the rest of my career, I think.
Yeah, it's really cool because I guess I had that sort of enlightening moment because we did a lot of advanced programming through our degree, but it was when I finally got to a user interface module. And then I realized that whenever I build stuff, I always build the interface first, because if I can understand how to use it, then putting the stuff behind it wasn't easy for me. But I could then understand what I was doing. I couldn't do anything until I got the interface sorted out. I guess that should have been I should have maybe cottoned onto my career before I actually did. So we're going to go and then have a bit of a discussion particularly around the work in the rail industry. But before we do that, we're just going to go and take a really quick break.
You are listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. We wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you for your support. You can help further by rating us through your podcast provider, sharing us through social media, and telling your friends and colleagues. Let's work together in raising awareness of the value in putting users at the center of what we do.
And welcome back. Today we're talking to David Golightly, particularly focusing on his work in the rail sector. But as we've just been talking about, that's not his only fruit. And this is my kind of ploy, I guess, that hopefully we'll get him back on again at some other point to tell us about some of the other stuff he gets on with as well. But David, so as you've already alluded to, you've done a broad variety of work in the rail sector. Can you give us, I guess, a potted overview, if you will, of the sort of topic areas that you've engaged with or that you're interested in?
Yeah, for sure. I was working at HFRG, University of Nottingham, and they've got a long, I can't avoid the pun, can I? A long track record in the rail sector. Professor John Wilson, very heavily involved in the kind of real growth as a research academic topic, and indeed as a practical topic of human factors and ergonomics in rail. It'd been around for a long time, but there was a real kind of push at the early 2000s, and John played a major role in that. And he was part of the group, obviously, led the group at HFRG. Topics that dealt with, so I first got involved in what we would call signaling. So that is the operational staff who were in a control room and set the signals. Used to be pulling levers, used to be pushing buttons. Now it's a kind of VDU based task, quite often with a high degree of automation sometimes. So they're controlling the signals, setting the routes. And again, that's kind of really interesting task. It's a kind of very visual task. But you see that they have to control a number of elements, not just about moving the trains. They're basically the eyes and ears of the network. So people who are wanting to go out on track, controlling level crossings sometimes, even interacting with people on stations, stuff like that. They kind of see what's going on. Again, tasks that's involving a lot of automation increasingly. So it's kind of now classic or key areas for human factors, the human automation relationship. So work in that. A lot of work in the maintenance side of things, and some of that has been about how track workers go out on track and how they organize themselves and protection around that. And particularly did a lot of work with Brendan Ryan at Nottingham, who's leading a whole project in that area. But increasingly it's become also about sort of safety of construction, safety leadership, safety culture. And there was somebody called Shelley Stiles, who's a behavioral safety consultant. She works in that actively, and I work with her in how she's doing her analysis and behavioral change programs. And then passenger experience. So it's this idea of what the passenger deals with, and that's kind of a holistic thing, not just what's on the train, but also the information that we use to get ourselves to the station, to work out what trains we're going to get, planning, ticketing, all that kind of stuff. It's one of those things that, again, going back to expertise versus novices, if you like. People who are commuters are really familiar with that task, but people who are very unfamiliar or unsure about traveling on trains, it can be quite a daunting experience. So how do we make this something that's tuned to the commuter experience, but also useful for these kind of tourists or less frequent or less confident travelers? And then I'll give a final shout out. Last year, I've got very much involved in freight. So a really fascinating area, somewhat, I think, a little overlooked in human factors so far. But, it's got a key role in our economy, key role in decarbonisation. Estimates last year in UK, Great Britain, rail freight was moved to the equivalent that would have been 70 million HGVs.
Wow.
So we can only wish to expand that, and particularly as we electrify more of the railway, we end up with a very low carbon form of transportation for moving goods, whether they be bulk goods and aggregates, or more kind of intermodal sort of containerized goods as well, moving them around the country. So that's become part of my work as well.
So before we get into some of the other bits, let's stick with the freight bit just for a second then. What sort of things are you getting involved with there? Because I believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but actually there is probably a lot more freight being transported than we recognize, because you don't see it really on a, except for the old freight train going through a station when you stood there.
Yeah.
But presumably it's quite highly used, is it?
So yeah, and that's a really good point, Barry. And one thing is that freight, as in recent history, it kind of ultimately flourished during COVID, because the passenger service was thin, but we still need to get stuff moved around the country. So it was a lot easier to get freight trains shifted. I mean, if you look at the big picture, obviously our rail service, a lot of it started not far away from where I am here in Newcastle. It was about shifting freight. It was about shifting coal up and down to out of mines and into ships and stuff like that. And obviously the rail freight sector has changed quite a lot. But if you look in recent history, it's really quite an area of growth. And definitely an emphasis more on intermodal goods. So yeah, that's happened during coronavirus. But I guess the other thing is, you're right, we don't see a lot of it because a lot of it moves at night. And therein lies the rub, because if you go into a freight yard, it truly is 24-hour operations. They're putting together freight trains and taking them apart and preparing them to go out in the network just as much in the dark, under floodlights, in the rain, all the rest of it, as they do during the daytime. So that, from a kind of traditional physical ergonomic standpoint, that introduces challenges, working at night, dark, fatigue management, those kind of things.
I was going to say, because I guess the safety issues there are sort of just simply multiplied just because of it being nighttime and not day. Because like I said, light, weather, it invariably rains, all that sort of stuff. That's going to be quite a veritable minefield for all issues, isn't it?
And I mean, freight yards are they're a rough old environment. Obviously, you're walking on ballast, walking on gravel, but I've been on a few freight yards. It's not even what you might call nice ballast.
Right.
It's really kind of, there's a lot of clutter in the yards. Again, historically, some of these yards are really, they go back a very long age. They've emerged over time and kind of got refigured. Used to shift a lot of coal. Now they're shifting other products. So there's a very organic environment, quite literally. So, slips, trips, those kind of things can be quite an issue in the freight yard environment. Yeah, lighting. I mean, what you see is that actually the people who are prepping trains, which is what I've got involved in, they walk very long distances over a shift. There's a lot of squats, a lot of bending down to check couplings, a lot of physical tasks, things like this. So it's physically quite a demanding job. So safety in that kind of sense, you're not tripping, banging your head, those kind of things are quite an issue.
So, sorry, just in on that respect then, because I've know that there was a bit of a reputation for, you know, people who work on the rail industry, particularly in rail yards and things like that. It is a very physical, but it's also a very historical role. You know, people, families work, father, son, mother, daughter type on the rail yard. When you're coming in and hopefully trying to improve what's going on, or at least offer advice, how is that received? Because obviously some people can be quite, I guess, stubborn to change and things like that. What's the, I guess, the attitude like when it comes to newfangled ways of working?
I've got to say, with only one, and this applies across all the operational rail staff that I've spoken to, driver signalers, but all the rest of it, they are normally an extremely welcoming bunch of people. Cool. They're really very happy to tell you about their work. They are, even in quite tough conditions, enthusiastic about their work. And again, I think this is one of the things that's interesting about the rail sector. Yes, it does have this kind of history. It does have this kind of enthusiasm about it. If you go into even the most lowly mess room in a porter cabin somewhere on the side of a freight site, they always have pictures of locos up and stuff like that. There's always a lot of rail chat. So generally, people are into what they do. They're normally really forthcoming about telling you about it. And yes, they acknowledge there's quite often challenges around it. But what becomes interesting to me is this is more the cognitive human factors, cognitive psychology, is how they go about this kind of decision making, how they go about the cognitive tasks that they engage in, because so much of it is up here. And it's going through that process of really trying to understand what they're doing. At first, it's just this wave of acronyms and history and stuff like that. But after a while, you start to pick it. Okay, so this means this, and this means that. And quite often they're in their silo. They've got a job to do. They think about getting that job done. And sometimes my role is just to take a bit of a step back and start to connect it with other functions and see how, again, from a human factors standpoint, how maybe pressures people are under in one particular environment may have been triggered by things upstream or have implications downstream as well.
So that's really cool. But I guess with that, so much knowledge being in their heads and almost passed down and things like that, human, or at least being able to measure or understand human performance must be quite challenging. How do you engage with that?
So the measuring of human performance, I think that is a good question. I think it's not like I can give you a straight answer. Well, we do this and we do that. I think that, to me, and that's particularly, I think, as a role as an academic, my role is often about coming up with the methodologies, thinking about the methodologies. So, my first project in rail was looking at situation awareness for rail signalers and what kind of methodologies that we could apply, taking some of the pre-existing methodologies. Do they really stack up for understanding situation awareness in rail signalers, what they are nominally keeping track of in their head? And I say that with a huge amount of caveats and scare quotes, because I don't think that's necessarily what they're doing. And I think, at the risk of giving you a politician's non-answer, I think that's the challenge. Quite often, by trying to measure human performance, we find it only gets us so far. So, okay, what's the missing piece, and what does that come down to, and what's that aspect that we can't really understand or access so readily? Because quite often that's the bit that in other language might be almost like the work is done, if you like. That's the bit that really allows operators, say in a freight yard or a signalers, to really perform their work. It's all that stuff that isn't immediately observable in kind of human performance. I think, not that I'm directly involved with it, but I think people are increasingly looking at physiological measures. The PhD that was going on in Nottingham, Abby Fowler, look at physiological measures with signalers to understand their performance. Work with drivers, some really interesting work going on at the moment to look at driver behavior as it comes out the signaling and control system to understand sort of performance factors. And indeed, this kind of leads to a project we're involved with at the moment, which is looking at data that's coming out of the rail system to understand, sort of how maybe minor performance issues at one point ripple back through the network.
Okay.
And so we're looking at how we can build, if you like, driver simulation models that actually a lot of simulation. If they've got a train, train network simulation, they'll have a train, it'll have like an idealized view of how the train should perform,
Right. Yeah.
or it might have a bit of noise in there, or they might have a kind of a slightly more realistic acceleration and braking curve. But quite often it doesn't have the sort of the causal analysis or the causal understanding of why people driving like that. Are they driving like that because of driving policy? Are they driving like that because of, that's the signals in front of them, that their expectations, those kind of things. So what we're trying to do is understand what can we put in the simulation model that might make the simulation drive a little bit more like how drivers drive. Because also, it's not. I'm always very keen to stress this. I'm sure you get this, Barry. It's not that drivers are some kind of noise or impediment in the system. They're also the people that give the system the resilience, and the signalers as well, by their choices, their decision making, their expertise. Says, well, I know I've got a pretty good expectation of what's going to happen ahead, so I'm going to do these things to buy myself some extra time to keep the system safe. All these kind of things. So how can we model that as well? The kind of ways that the operational staff in the railways maintain performance and resilience as well.
So basically you're talking about modeling the human attributes within the system and then incorporating that into the overall simulation to give that more again, it's not dissimilar, I guess, to, I think there was that film, wasn't there, about the pilot who landed on the Hudson. And that was again interesting, where they had the simulation. You could have made that decision, you could have made it, and they were like, well, actually no, if you put the human decision making piece into that, real human decision making, not artificial stuff, actually it takes a lot longer and things like that. And it's something, I guess, with technology nowadays we don't necessarily appreciate in the same way. So I guess this work is really vitally important.
Well, and it's understand. This is why a lot of this comes into the realm as well of it being a human automation. It's a major theme, I think, across all the domains that we deal with in human factors. Is kind of human automation, interaction. Ideally, we'd move towards a notion of teaming, but how are the humans and automation working together? Because again, you can automate the pants off everything, but we're still dealing with the Bainbridge's ironies of automation. I've now automated all the things that I couldn't trust the human to do, and okay, the automation doesn't work. So human, can you just step back in again and take over? And humans like, what am I doing? What we really need to get to a position is we understand what the strengths of the automation are, not just function allocation, but how can those two things work together? So a kind of a joint cognitive systems view. And what's interesting is that the rail sector, GB, but worldwide, is increasingly adopting automation. It's higher and higher levels of decision making. So automation previously would set the signals for the trains, but now it's starting to make more decisions about, well, maybe we should do this instead of this in order to maintain the timetable. And okay, how do you communicate that to an operator so that they remain informed, are part of that decision-making process, particularly when it comes to controlling the rail network, because that might be what they need to start making decisions about whether a track worker can go up track safely or whether they can open up a level crossing, those kind of things. And automation is very important in the maintenance world as well. So increasingly, we've got remote condition monitoring solutions that are predicting the state of an asset in the future. So it's not just this asset's faulty, but it's excuse me, this asset might be faulty in the future. And so you start to move into the realms of probabilities and sometimes probabilities of probabilities. So how do you communicate that to an operator, and how do they integrate that into their work as well? Because I always say it's not just about user-centered design, it's about user-centered deployment. So how do you deploy a new technology so there's maybe two systems running in parallel so people can become accustomed to the new technology before you switch the old one off? How do you change things like shift patterns? Because if you're now saying an asset is maintained predictively, means you're not necessarily going out on track every 2 weeks. You're going out when the prediction is telling you to go out on track. So how does that affect things like shift working and rostering, things like that? You need to adapt those so that your human operators, your staff, can still work comfortably with the outputs of your remote condition monitoring solution.
I'm going to say that user-centered deployment is certainly a new term for me. This actually highlights the entire reason I do this podcast, because it's a great way for me to learn new stuff. But you're right, because I guess for many people, particularly if you're not, you might be a rail user, but you don't, we do take a lot of it for granted and get grumpy when the train doesn't turn up at the right point. But if you're having to deal with a lot more automation, a lot more decision making and that type of thing, we don't think about the other bits. So we think about, well, this train's coming in, this train's leaving station, da. But actually you might need a human on track to do a bit of repair or something like that, which is not scheduled. It's not that. It's you need to make sure that bit of track is safe, and therefore you've got to bring everybody into the loop about exactly what is going on, why it's going on, and people might not have looked at that for ages because it's been automated for so long. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's we talk a bit about systems views and human factors, but I think that's the system views in railways. It's fascinating because everything is so deeply interconnected. When there's a disruption, so many things are interconnected, and so many things processes are put into play, because you've got everything in terms of trying to fix the asset. Say if it's a fault, trying to fix the asset. What do you do with all the trains you've got which are sitting around? Do you try and redistribute them, or you've got an alternative train plan? That's where something like these advanced forms of automation may work. But what's the visibility that they have of the kind of maintenance activities that are going on? And then what you're telling all your passengers, or indeed your customers generally, because you've also got a bunch of freight customers who are like, well, where's my train? What do you tell all your customers? How do you communicate with them? What's the best way of communicating with them, keeping them informed, giving them alternatives? Those kind of questions.
Well, that sort of segues us nicely into the next bit I wanted to talk around, which was around passenger experience. Because as you just quite rightly said, it's all very well making sure that the train system runs right, or if it isn't running right, we can find ways of making it run right. But what have you been doing around about basically the passenger experience and how all this fundamentally gets basically communicated to them, or how it affects them?
Well, I guess there's two sides to it. There's directly what the passenger sees. So in terms of passenger information, giving them information, disruption information in a disrupted situation, but indeed just in sort of routine situations, when everything is going well, giving people the right level of information so that they can manage their journey. And then there's the operational side. So what do you do behind the scenes to make sure that you can get the rail and maintain the rails? Again, this notion of, and I mean it in a sort of David Wood sense, resilience. How do you keep the system running? What's the human role in making sure that things that start to go wrong, you can pull them in again without anybody really notices it? When things go really wrong, how do you repair them? Yeah. And how do you learn from that? How do you adapt? So there's the operational side. I mean, I think from a passenger side, there's almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right.
Which is, at the bottom, do I get there?
Yes.
And, sometimes that can be at risk. But once you get above that, it's okay. Am I getting there on time? Am I getting there in comfort? And you've got this layer. And somewhere at the top of that, you've got the equivalent of I've got a really comfortable, seamless journey, which probably involves, again, not just the rail journey itself, but the interconnectivity with those elements at the beginning and the end. And also your experience in a station. So I think one thing that's interesting, we've done some work with Twitter to understand how Twitter fits in with all the different other information streams that a passenger might look at when they're managing their experience, particularly during a disrupted state. And then also other projects to understand, information on your phone, smartphone information that will give you, again, a whole passenger experience, not just managing the train bit, but how to get the station, how to get out the other end. And that becomes quite complex because, of course, going back to my HCI roots, the user interface, you've got to get the usability of that right.
Yeah.
But actually, the user interface is really an expression of the whole underpinning transport system. So then you get into these questions of, does your user interface really communicate what's happening with those aspects of the transport system that you need to understand? And that differs whether you're a commuter or an expert, as opposed to going on an infrequent journey, a tourist, or somebody who's less confident.
Yeah. No, it is. The bit you said about Twitter makes me laugh, because it is one of the things I am very guilty of if we held up or in any way, because I'm not a frequent I'm not a frequent rail user, though I use it fairly often. But as soon as you held up, I'm straight on there to whoever the rail the company is, sort of saying held up now, and you always get that it will make absolutely no difference, I'm fairly sure, but you always get that slightly better feeling if the company then has messaged you back to say, oh, we're really sorry.
For sure.
And they probably don't give you any more information, but it does probably enhance that experience of like, oh, at least somebody's listening.
For sure.
Which is interesting.
And also, you've got to think, if they answer a tweet, that's a fairly cheap thing. I mean, they've got to pay somebody who's, in the hot seat, and I've seen those people work, and man, they've got to type fast.
Yeah,
they are busy people. Yeah. But it's a fairly thing. If you then ring up a call center and say, that becomes a bit more expensive. Just the business, management, the business processes. If you write a letter, that becomes even more expensive. So actually, managing customer experience through Twitter is a very cost-effective way to give you the information you need, to give you sometimes, it's just apology sometimes. Sorry, we're doing what we can. Interesting things that you see people like it during flooding, the train operating companies or Network Rail will say, here it is, here's the flood, here's the bit of track we're talking about.
Get ahead of it, yeah.
Deep underwater. Some of the regions, they give really quite detailed information about what's happening during faults, and they do it in a very informal, very accessible manner.
Yes.
But they give you quite a lot of information. This is a point fail, and this is what's happening. And this is what we'll do afterwards. I think Twitter's fascinating because it's really taken I think we're beyond taken, but it took the rail sector by surprise to quite an extent, because all of a sudden you've got this information, you've got passengers who are demanding information faster than the control routes that really the rail system. It's used to announcements,
Yes,
and all of a sudden people were like, okay, I need information now. Why are you not giving me this information? So the Twitter team started off in marketing departments, but they very quickly ended up migrating into the control room. So if you go into a control room now, there's quite often somebody who's involved in information processing, information controller, and they'll be fronting up the Twitter accounts and giving real-time information about what's happening.
And like I say, because they generally do feel sort of semi-formal communication language, that type of thing. Are they basically entrusted to basically just fire information out as they see fit, or do they have a right? I'm about to send this tweet. Can you just okay it? Is it?
They're mostly entrusted, but I think they know when if it's a celebrity complaining, such as yourself, Barry.
Oh, if only.
Then I think they know. You can imagine sometimes it's an MP.
Yeah.
I think they know when they need to
check
it, escalate it, so that and again, it's one of these, because of the hugely interconnected again, John Wilson, you sort of say, the railway is complex socio-technical system. It's people and technology working together. It's multiple functions, all interconnected. It's an open system. Things dribble out into space. Your passengers leave the station and dribble out into space. But equally, things from outside of the railway system, like weather and crowds coming from football matches, they all affect your system. So it's just, it's so complex in that kind of way. So a number of things, again, those Twitter operators are really, really quite knowledgeable in terms of knowing, somebody said, why is it's only 4 cars on this train? Why is it only 2 cars today? Well, because of this reason and that reason, and this will happen tomorrow, whatever. They've really got to know quite a lot of operational stuff.
I think that's probably the most common complaint whenever we go and watch the movie Cardiff and trying to get the train back. There's invariably never enough carriages, and you can always see Twitter explode. Why is there not enough carriages?
Yeah, well, again, your Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's pretty low down the bottom. That am I going to get any kind of seat or any sort of degree of? Because again, we have an expectation now. A lot of us that work on the train. Well, just do that work on the train, but. It's really hard to work on the train when you're standing in the doorway of the toilet.
Yes, laptops don't work quite so well then.
Yeah.
So what does all this mean then because you quite rightly opened our eyes into, it's not just about passengers, it's about freight, it's about, you've got so many different people working where we don't see them, where the general public don't see them. They're basically making magic happen. What does all this mean for the experience of the train service itself?
That's a good question. I mean, again, since I've been involved, there's a lot of talk about the railways becoming much more passenger focused. Indeed, in the freight sector, customer focused. But I think what's interesting is how you actually operationalize that. So again, passenger focused doesn't necessarily mean passenger centered. It sounds like a slightly subtle difference, but it's one thing about we're going to do all this stuff and we're going to make sure the passenger, as opposed to, right, what does the passenger need? How are we going to meet those needs? And you can really see that there is a change happening. Again, over the last 10 years, I think certain train operators have really done more to move into that very passenger-centered view of the world. So I think there are improvements in that. But again, I think it's about the holistic end-to-end experience. What is it that a passenger wants from the minute they leave the door to the minute they get to the door and the other end? Or what are all the various factors that will influence that? Because again, and this is people like, I don't know if you come across Glenn Lyons, who's, major academic in things like transport planning and transport policy and a lot of stuff about transport information. We're not rational beings when we go out into the rail network or indeed any transport network. If we're unfamiliar, there's a lot of anxiety about that. But whether we admit it or not, I think we're always leaving the cave. And if we are familiar with it, there's a huge amount of habit and expectation built in with that. So the idea that would be you're doing some rational information processing and weighing off our options, I think that rarely happens. So I think therefore it becomes interesting how we process and present information in such a way that it reflects how people really do decision making and really interact with their journey experience, if you like. And that's holistic. So I'm always impressed. I first saw it on the London Underground when the announcement came over the tannoy and it was synchronized with the digital displays down the end of the carriage.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So it wasn't just, here's some information, here's some other information. Those two were synchronized with each other. I noticed the train I got the other day, LNER, that had that covered. I get on the train now, it's got a little red, amber, green telling me whether that seat is reserved, available, or it's okay now, but you might have to get up later on. Those kind of little things are just, they really improve my journey experience, I think. Remove my anxiety, particularly for those less frequent trips. And very importantly, we have to think about in a post-COVID world, we're getting almost up to the previous passenger numbers, but there's a lot more infrequent, longer journeys being taken now in our post-COVID world, more leisure travel, more people who are I'm going to do 2 days in the office down in London. I'm going to go back up to my country pile or out into the suburbs or whatever. So people are taking more infrequent journeys, less familiar journeys. It's a different way of thinking about your journey experience.
Yeah, because I guess there's nothing more anger stoking, I guess, than before you even get on the railway, if you can't get parked or you can't actually get to the station in the first place, and then when you get home, if you can't easily get out of the station, and I can sort of think of 3-4 different examples of that.
Yeah,
so that whole, you're right, that whole end-to-end experience is fundamentally very important.
You raise a really good point as well, because it's typically when I go on a journey, I call me old-fashioned, but I like to come back as well, Barry.
That's a novelty, isn't it?
So you see a lot of things like apps to provide, interconnectivity with your, to the station. But I'm working on a shared travel project at the moment. We're going to provide shared travel to the station, but that also then has to get you back from the station when you come home at the end of the day. So you've got to think about how people see journeys. There's a bunch of interconnected steps, all of which require decision making, which is typically not that rational with a capital R, and is a little bit more habit-based, emotionally based, these kind of things. And the key thing is that's quite a high set of barriers you've got to jump over. And when people start to see frustration, what do? They get in their car, or you end up with certain either communities or socio-demographic groups that just don't have the opportunity to travel so much.
Yeah, and that's true. And I guess going into one of my sort of pet projects at the moment is around, we want to get more and more people onto public transport to reduce the dependence on cars and things like that, in order to help with climate change and that type of thing. So if we get all this sort of stuff right, this whole interconnectivity between different types of public transport, I think is something quite close to my heart, because of because I just think it's fundamentally important. So I could go on about this for quite a long time, I think, but from your perspective, where next? What are the next challenges, or what the challenges you're trying to hit now for that human factors you think that human factors can help with?
So I think understanding greater levels of automation, the digital railway. So again, automation makes it suggest it's kind of like, it's going to be more of a computer doing the thinking. But actually it's not. It's more about a digital railway. It's more about the exchange of data between multiple functions, where previously that wasn't possible. So the good news is that gives people much kind of greater shared visibility from an operational side. And indeed, there's a cut you can make of that and give that shared visibility over to the passengers even as well. But then understanding what information is appropriate to share is quite challenging. So there's a difference in what information you and I might need to make a joint decision, as opposed to information I need to make a decision and you need to just act upon. So how do we share that information? How do we visualize it in such a way that it can be used between quite disparate functions and disparate groups, particularly when they're not co-located necessarily? So I'm really interested in the kind of systems models. Always dabbled a little bit with things like cognitive work analysis to understand how we can map out the functions of, say, parts of the railway. Or indeed, we've done some work again with Brendan and colleagues at Nottingham to map out a map of the universe, if you like, the whole railway system, and understand what the role of people are in that railway system. So if you change one role, what might be the interconnected effects? But I'm also interested in approaches, say, like East. So trying to understand how we can model shared awareness, shared situation awareness, shared tasks and information in things like disruption management. So the right people are getting the right information so that they can take the right actions. We don't want situations which have happened in the past, I think, where, a good disruption management strategy is thought out in the event of a disruption. But if that's not communicated to people on the platforms, either passengers or indeed the staff on the platforms, it doesn't kind of stack up. So I think that's a real area of interest for me. The other area I would say is this: I've had the opportunity to come to Newcastle to work with some really great people working in simulation. and understanding more about how we can stick a human element in that simulation, because it has a twin benefit of improving the simulation, but also my ability to express to them the human performance characteristics makes me have to think really hard about, can I formalize sort of things like workload models? We stick in a basic workload model. How can we formalize that workload model in such a way that it can be used effectively within a simulation? And there's a lot of challenge back to me to say, well, that doesn't really work. What do you mean by that? How do we operationalize this in a simulation model? I've got to be really kind of clear on my thinking.
Yeah. So you're generally going to keep yourself quite busy then, by the sounds of it. There's lots to keep you amused.
Oh yeah, well, it's good to it keeps me off the streets. Yeah.
That I mean, that sounds. I mean, the crossover from certainly from a very selfish perspective in terms of situational awareness, shared situational awareness, data overload, all that sort of stuff. It sounds like there's lots of really interesting topics that I really need to keep an eye on, because it's sounds really interesting. So we'll get into this final bit, because I recognize I've kept you for quite a long time. But so these are the final three questions that I ask everybody, and they're cunningly called the final three. So if you had a book or a paper, do you have one that you go back to and use repeatedly or read repeatedly? And it can be technical, or it could be a fiction book, if that be the case, or you just not have time. Or
No, I do. If I was to choose a technical book, I do keep getting out of our library, and I keep getting out of the Nottingham Library as well, the Cognitive Systems Engineering book by Holnagel and Woods. I keep going back to that. I think for a number of reasons. I think the way that it talks about the relationship between humans and technology in the broader sense, rather than just automation, but the way it then makes you think about the control of a system, and it starts to link into some stuff which I've only dabbled in, but about cybernetics and how we describe the control of systems, because ultimately the railways is about signalers controlling the network, a driver is controlling trains, but then the whole thing is really about controlling the whole rail environment. And there's some key principles in there, but also the way it's written. I find it a bit of I don't know which metaphor to go for here, whether it's a Rorschach ink blot or
right.
a Rosetta Stone, but I keep going back to it. I don't always understand it, but it makes me think more and more about, okay, what are the people that I'm observing? What are they trying to do? At which point are they trying to, say, apply strategies to allow them to understand a very complex work environment? At which point are they engaged in trade-offs to control a very complex work environment? So I keep going back to that book. I find it challenging and fascinating.
Cool. So if you could go back a number of years to younger Dave and give yourself some advice, what would it be?
I mean, there's a couple of things, I suppose, from a kind of my own personal development. I think to have been bolder earlier on in getting involved in human factors. I spent quite a lot of time in kind of human computer interaction, but really what interested me was understanding how people, I guess, do their jobs, how people express their expertise.
Yeah.
So I think I would have kicked myself up the bum to get involved in that earlier. I think also to just keep on top of current theories. I'm still telling myself that now, but keep on top of theoretical developments.
Yeah.
Because I think it's very easy to end up reading about your domain. I know we haven't talked about the conference particularly, but I think one thing that works well, it works brilliantly about the EHF conference is multiple domains there, multiple disciplines. We all meet to talk about human factors, but as healthcare and transport and we all get together. And I think reading about those other disciplines and hearing about them at a more theoretical level, I think is really important. So I think, not to get bogged down in my particular domain or get too focused, but keep a broad scope.
I'm going to admit, and I think I've said this on a couple of previous episodes and to pretty much most people I've been talking to recently, I liked at the conference where Alex Steadman sort of challenged us all to go into one of the sectors that makes you feel uncomfortable, that you've never really done before. And so I spent a fair bit of time in the health domain and the well-being one. And I just found that absolutely fascinating. And it was really good seeing different disciplines, different things, and being able to think, right, how would I apply them? And also, how could I make a difference to these? I guess in your role as in looking after the program, being co-chair of the program, you have to read every paper, or read most of them anyway, and therefore, that's almost you get to do that almost deliberately that way.
Yeah. You raise a good point with healthcare. It's some of the strongest papers that we have in the conference. Particularly going back to what I've been talking about a little bit, things like resilience and understanding resilience and understanding adaptation. There's been some really fantastic work, and now there's an increasing body of work looking at automation and autonomy in healthcare. So again, it's similar challenges, but from a different domain. Where are we doing the same things? Which point are they different? And again, one thing I think, I could say this about rail, but equally dealt with other domain. Again, it's just a surface level. You might say, oh, railway, controlling trains must be a bit like air traffic control. That's what I thought at first, but actually it's different. It's more like a process control task. Right. And at which point is, I'm speculating here, but at which point is organizing a station more like organizing a ward or something like that, where these parallels are quite often hidden. It's only when you start to look at these other domains, start to draw those parallels in that kind of way.
I guess, because I guess it's one of the ways I always use whenever I go to a new domain and try and do the sort of exploration piece. I try and I don't try and invoke conflict, but I try and get people to sort of show where the differences are by saying, oh, well, this must be just like this then. But this, I hadn't really seen that it was such a strong difference that way. That I've completely gone off track again. So let's drag us back on track. We can both pull that gag now. So the final question to you then really is, it's a lazy one for me because I want your advice on who would you think I should interview? Who would make a good guest on the podcast?
Oh, that's a good question. First of all, you're going to I think you're going to interview Nora.
Yes.
So from a rail perspective, massely knowledgeable. I'm going to give you a few suggestions here, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
I don't know if I've worked for a long time now with Sarah Sharples, and both from an academic perspective, but also now her role as chief scientific advisor at the DFT. She's got a completely different perspective. While her role is broader than human factors considerably, she now has insight, I think, and something to share with us about how human factors can get involved in things like policy.
Mm-hmm.
And also, Mark Young is really interesting chap. Having worked in a number of aspects, he does, he has a key role in rail accident investigation branch, but is also still thinks a lot about the fundamentals of human factors, the fundamentals of psychology. I think I'm right in saying he's got a book coming out, and Underload, soon. So there will be some suggestions.
We will. I will chase them up and basically say that it's your fault. No, that's brilliant, David. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your insights with us. And
my pleasure.
For anybody who wants to get in touch with Dave, then all of his details are on the website, linked to this episode. Please go and check them out. And thank you to everyone who's been listening and sharing in this experience. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues, and if you're feeling especially generous, do leave us a review or even just a comment on our socials, so then other people know that they can come and listen too. But for now, see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. Please do get in touch with your thoughts, questions and comments. You can contact us on social media such as Twitter, LinkedIn and Facebook at 1202 Podcast. See you next time. And remember, it's more than just common sense.